outcomes and in its impacts. And to be able to, along the whole way, to be able to track the progress of this program and course correct and also harvest the results of the program as they come through, as well as collect the evidence from the implementation. So it's a big job.
Yeah, sure.
It sure is, but it will be very interesting along the way, and some of my colleagues here today on the panel will talk about some of these subjects I've mentioned a bit in more depth. So back to you, Vico. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sandra. It was very interesting. Thank you so much. Now we'll turn to Mike Ward. You have been leading, Mark, the SIF's Transformational Change Learning Partnership and contributing to work on just transitions and strategic program evaluations. So tell us how just transitions is going to help the ACT program. What are the aspirations and how is it going to work?
Yeah, thanks very much, Vico. Sure, yeah. Accelerating a coal transition implies that things are going to get faster, obviously. One of the big tricks in that process is to ensure that nobody's left behind, and that is the just transition discussion. So just transition has been around as a concept since at least the 1970s. And what the SIF did was it kind of anticipated that, that this issue of justice around accelerating a coal transition was going to be key. And so in 2019, put together a Just Transition Initiative that really tried to synthesize many insights from many different sectors around what do we mean by a just transition, and tried to distill out, I suppose, in a way, the essence of just transition work. And identified, I think, 3 key areas that were part of the framework that was developed. The first one was procedural justice, so who gets to decide in these processes, who is involved and who is empowered. The second key area is distributional justice, so who gets what in these processes, who gets the goods that are produced and who lands up with the bads. And the third area is the depth of transformational intent. In other words, how radical do we want to make these transitions? And how deeply do we want to ensure things like access, things like equity, things like empowerment? So we worked with that framework and then started to do a number of case studies, which in a way ground-truthed the insights that we were developing there. So we worked in South Africa, did a case study on just transition work in South Africa, a kind of retrospective look at many of the processes that the SIF and our partners, the multilateral development banks, and of course the South African government had put in place. And tried to understand what does this framework mean in the context of the transition that's happening in South Africa, a kind of coal to clean transition. We did a similar case study in India, and as Mafalda mentioned, also did it in a more kind of focused regional way in Jharkhand and in Mpumalanga. So we did these case studies. I think that they informed a lot the work that has subsequently happened in South Africa in both the Accelerating Coal Transition and in the Just Energy Transition Partnership. Which have been kind of almost in a way leaders in some of this work. So it was very important in shaping that. And out of all of that work, a recognition that there is a need to support people to operationalize these big ideas. And so a lot of work in the last little while that's been done by the Just Transition Initiative team has focused on developing a toolbox of resources that will help countries to go through and I suppose inform these processes. So that toolbox will be shared in the SIF Connect space. I really encourage people to have a look at it. It is an amazing resource full of case examples from all over the world of tools that can be used for each one of these aspects, things like stakeholder engagement, gender inclusion. So really have a look at that. I'd like to come back quickly, though, to this notion of transformational intent and how radical we make these transitions, because it really is no good if we take big coal corporates or conglomerates and just shift that into big solar corporates and conglomerates. If we continue to ignore community interests, issues of access, issues of ownership, we're not going to have the kind of transition that is required in order for it to be just. And so the Transformational Change Learning Partnership has been trying to understand what we mean by transformational change. It is part, as Sandra said, of our overarching impact statement as SIF. It's also at COP27 in the decision document, all countries were urged to take a transformational approach to the work that they're doing around climate. So it is front and center at the moment. And so the Transformational Change Learning Partnership, a group of about 600 individuals, about 350 institutions, have been working over the last couple of years, first of all, to define transformational change with a kind of normative definition. So transformational change can be good or bad. It's what we put into it that actually counts. And so we focused on things like climate neutrality, on inclusivity, on equity, on resilience, and on building sustainable development pathways. And by giving it this normative approach, we then open up a kind of normative and principle-based focus to the work that we do in all of SIF's new programs, including ACT. So that was the definition. We then identified a number of dimensions that need to be present in order for transformational change to happen, things like relevance, systemic change, speed, scale, adaptive sustainability. And then to support the development of investment plans, and in this instance, the ACT investment plans, we've developed a series of questions that help people to think through what would this mean in our context, given the different interest groups that we're working with over a period of time. And so we've worked up those questions. And those questions at the moment are really informing the development of investment plans in the new SIF programs, as I've said, including ACT. And they will also shape the evaluative principles that we take forward. So as we look at the design work around investment plans, the programmatic planning and the new projects, and the implementation, so formative evaluative work, and the kind of summative evaluative work looking back at what we've achieved. We'll keep going back to these questions. So they're important, and the Evaluation and Learning Initiative within SIF is developing toolkits for each of the new programs. So there will be an ACT toolkit focused on impact, particularly around things like transformational change and just transitions. As Sandra mentioned, we're also working, of course, on impact evaluation with DIME, with the World Bank, the Monitoring and Reporting Unit, and the ENL. So I think that maybe just to wrap up, Vico, I think that these are big concepts. It's been very useful to unpack those concepts, to identify frameworks that we can then apply in particular contexts. And we've seen those frameworks being used in things like the South African, what they call the Just Transition Framework in South Africa. It will guide all of the Just Transitions work in South Africa. And we see extensive reference to the work that SIF has done, the notion of procedural justice, the notion of distributional justice. They talk about the transition needing to be deep, just, and transformational in that framework. So I think that it's influencing what has happened. The big challenge now is to continue to operationalize that as we start to implement the ACT program in different countries. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mike. You were talking about South Africa, so let's turn to Thundo Lukuko. He is, South Africa is one of the first ACT countries like Brazil. And Thundo, you work at the South African Climate Action Network, SACAN. And this is a network that comprises 30 NGOs that fight against climate change and that foster climate action. So, Thundo, could you please tell us how South Africa is working towards a just transition away from coal?
Thank you so much, Vico. Good morning, colleagues. So, just for some context, so I think SIF's work started in South Africa around 2009, and at the time it was supporting various initiatives including solar water heating, energy efficiency, wind and CSP investments, which totaled around $462 million. Similarly, or rather at the same time, we also experienced the first coal kind of risk, if you will, which introduced us for the first time to load shedding. And so as a result, these conditions led to the government recognizing the need for accelerated transition away from coal. And so the other very important key, I think, in our country was then the socioeconomic dynamics in our country. We all know that South Africa has got very high unemployment, inequality, and poverty as well, which characterizes much of our society. But the other one that's important for this conversation is the issues around electricity access. Now, in response to these the state had a very strong transformational agenda, which can be seen in our National Development Plan of 2030. And so moving towards today, these issues are still very much relevant. And so it brings in the conversation around just transition, which initially started around the just transition transaction, which then later evolved into what Mike talked about, which is the just transition framework. And this specific space is very much lends itself to a social dialogue. So all social partners are very much encouraged to participate in the space so that it brings in these divergent views from organized labor, private sector, government, and of course civil society to try and understand how these various interests might find themselves in the framework itself, but also in the implementation thereof. And so as then the process moved on, of course, we then later learned about the Just Energy Transition Partnership. But I would like to focus on a very specific example, which is not necessarily an ACT project, but it is funded by the World Bank, and that is the Komati project, which is currently underway. And in that space, it was really intended to be the pilot, if you will, for how just transitions are going to happen. And specifically, Komati is looking at the repurposing of a coal-fired power station away from obviously its current business to, at least in the Komati sense, transition into mini-grid technology and how we could expand on solar specifically. And what we've learned in that process is, of course, the issues of distributive justice and procedural justice seem to be at the fore, particularly in the case of the Just Transition framework and the Presidential Climate Commission. However, there's still a missing element that is the restorative justice element. And so, in a country like South Africa, where the triple challenge is critical in any intervention as we move forward, it's important for us to then consider how then some of these social dimensions might bring themselves more so to the fore in any particular intervention. And so I wanted to ask in the room if colleagues had seen, there was a video that once circulated of a community that I think was from Southeast Asia, I don't know exactly where, but the community was actually smashing solar panels. It looked like a solar farm, and then they're on top of it, and they were smashing these panels. And for us, when we looked at that, it really represented a very real risk to not only obviously the investments that are being made in here, but also how the social dimensions have to be really, really considered and how we can work with these people. Because much of what we're talking about also, as has already been discussed, focuses on the people element. And so in this space, in this regard, we looked at then from an M&E perspective, two key criterion, which would be in addition to the OECD ones that were developed, and it's specifically called the transformative equity, which looks at how then, as a state wanting to transform, you can look at specific interventions and how those interventions lend themselves to transformation. And then the second one is climate and ecosystem health, because obviously as we're talking about climate change, right? So many of these interventions speak to how water resource is going to be used, how land is going to be used, and the impacts thereof in that specific intervention. And so these two criteria then were developed and are now forming part of South Africa's Department of Planning, Monitoring and Evaluation framework, so that in the planning of particularly the implementation of the Just Transition, these ones are considered so that these elements are not left behind. And then lastly, another key aspect that we've identified as something that is critical for us to consider is the one on climate mediation specifically. Because as we're now moving towards clean coal technology, not clean coal, but clean technologies, there are interests that exist there. And there's tensions that will arise, and we're seeing this. And so there's a need to then engage with the various stakeholders beyond specific impasses around the transition itself. And so the mediation aspect allows us to specifically focus on the solutions and getting beyond that impasse so that we can actually achieve the end state and the vision that we would have all agreed to, at least as encompassed in the Just Transition Framework document of South Africa. So Vic, let me end there for now, and then I'll take some questions afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Thando. You know, here in Brazil, I worked for 30 years as a reporter in the biggest national network, Global, and I've seen several projects that includes these two dimensions, the social and the environmental one. And all the time that they were together, it had great results. And if sometimes they are not considered as one whole, it will fail, that's for sure. So thank you so much, Thando. Now we will move to another subject very important. Nina Kolibashkina, that's correct? Kolibashkina. Nina, she will talk about social inclusion as well, and also about gender. She led CIF's work on women climate leadership. So Nina, can you share how CIF's work on social inclusion and gender supports the energy transition in ACT countries?
Thank you so much. Indeed, I mean, we already started to talk about this agenda in all of our speeches. But when we talk about gender and coal, very often in the first conversation, when we try to talk about gender, we get a question, well, how is it relevant? Conversations first start focusing around, conversations around retirement of coal plants and closure of the coal mines are usually focusing on the technical aspects, the facilities, the infrastructure. And then when they start to look at people, it's usually the people who are formally employed in those sectors, and those are predominantly men. So why gender? How is it relevant? In fact, the impacts of coal transitions on women are more severe and less visible. Women are more often employed in artisanal mining, in informal value chains around coal production, coal power plants, so that they're not visible to the policymakers, but the impacts of transitions on them are very, very significant. They also play unpaid informal roles. And we know, looking at the transitions, especially coal transitions that have happened in the past in the Western countries, we also know that with the unemployment of men, very often the issues of domestic violence, gender-based violence in the communities rise. In some cases, if we use the case of South Africa, Eskom, the power supplier, is not only responsible for most of the jobs in certain communities, they're also responsible for provision of social services, utilities, and how are those issues going to be addressed? Again, women, as those who are the main caretakers in the families, are more severely affected in interruptions with access to utilities and the services. So if we use the terminology of just transition from the distributional justice, distributional effects, there is a need for very targeted interventions within the larger investment projects that are being designed to ensure employment, livelihood opportunities for women. If we look at the employment of women in the energy sector, we know that the numbers are very, very small, but as we're transitioning to renewable energy, there are more and more opportunities because a lot of jobs are less physically demanding. How to make sure that women are there and how to start making that transition from the very beginning by ensuring that even in high school, girls are enrolled in STEM education and then they follow the career path that will get them there, and then how do we keep them in those jobs. Those are the types of considerations that we expect that the projects, investment projects that will be developed under ACT will include under gender mainstreaming. Within CIF, we have quite a strong gender policy, but also our implementing partners, the multilateral development banks, increasingly are putting a lot of attention on gender mainstreaming, and we are expecting that already, and we have ways to ensure and enforce some of it, that those type of actions are included as part of the projects. And this is very important, but that doesn't address the issue of procedural justice. How do we make sure that women are at those decision-making tables, starting from the national level decision-making, but down to the communities where decisions are made about what kind of approaches, what kind of interventions need to be designed? And this is where at CIF, broadly, even beyond ACT, we've, in the past 2 years, been really doing some work on conceptualizing what is women climate leadership and how to systematically address various normative and structural barriers to women climate leadership, how to analyze the gaps, but also how to identify opportunities to advance it. Actually, after the coffee break, after this session, we will have a dedicated session on applying the conceptual framework on women climate leadership that we're just about to publish. It's also a substantial document of 100 pages. We at SIF like to provide solid knowledge products. And we will be discussing how to apply that framework to the particular case of Brazil. And we have a number of exciting women leaders lined up. But I'm selling the next intervention, so back to ACT. So in ACT, we were actually fortunate enough to get some dedicated funding from Canada, and we do very much hope to mobilize more dedicated funding from other donors to support what we call a women-led coal transition grant mechanism. So WOLCOT is the abbreviation, and through this grant mechanism, we are really focusing on amplifying the voice of women and disadvantaged groups, so looking a little bit broader, in the communities affected by transition, to help them articulate the priorities that are related to transition, the priorities that need addressing, but also to channel resources more directly to them so that they can manage those resources in addressing those on those priorities. This is our vision for WOLCOT, so it is a rather modest grant mechanism at the moment, and it would consist of two main parts. Of course, the largest amount is actually grants to the multilateral development banks to do this work, but more specifically to go over and beyond their general gender mainstreaming and really look for ways of getting resources as low to the community level as possible and into the hands of the women organizations. And we've just, I think today, approved a series of 6 preparatory grants to the MDBs in South Africa and Indonesia, the 2 countries that are more advanced in their thinking on ACT, to start the preparatory process for that. And then the second component of this is the role of SIF-EU, and our small but mighty gender team in supporting various analytical coordination capacity building activities to really help the MDBs come together with the development partners, see what is happening, because the resources are very small and there are some other efforts that are happening in the space. So to map various efforts to try to really ensure as much coherence and synchronization and complementarity as possible, and to advance this agenda, but also engage in advocacy. And I have my colleague from one of the countries where we've started this work, where it's more advanced, to do some follow-up presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Nina. Thank you so much, Nina. Very important stuff. And now to continue with gender and social inclusion, we have another international contribution coming from Indonesia. Maya Mulcis, she's the director of Women in Mining and Energy in Indonesia. Do you hear us, Maya?
Yes, I can hear you clearly.
Thank you so much for joining us. Where are you exactly?
I'm in Jakarta at the moment, at the office.
Okay. So, thanks so much, Maya. Can you share with us your perspective?
Yeah, just a quick one. Thank you, everyone. So I'm going to continue what Nina's mentioned before about the energy transition status in Indonesia at the moment. So in the wake of COP26, Indonesia's government have made some new climate commitment. So from the NDC, 26% reduction from the business as usual, and 45% emission reduction from the conditional things. And then renewable energy targets with 23% of renewable energy diversification by 2030. And net zero target by 2060 or earlier. So for coal, no new coal-fired power plants committed after 2022. But this is supported by the new regulation and on the acceleration of renewable energy development, where the new energy development for the that's allowable is just for the captive power plant. And then this is just only applied for the national strategic project. And the regulation is supply under certain circumstances, including 35% of emission reduction within the 10 years of power plant operations. And commitment no more coal after 56. Early retirement, same as in Africa, early retirement of or of coal-fired power plant, and this is also one of the areas where the Just Energy Transition Partnership are focusing on. So back to Just Energy Transition Partnership. So last year, the government of Indonesia has signed agreement with the international partner groups on the JETP, includes a pledge of 20 billion USD to support the coal transition in Indonesia. So the JETP Secretariat currently is preparing a comprehensive investment and policy plan that will be launched around August in this year. So at this stage, the JETP Secretariat is in close collaboration with the MDB partners that divided into 4 working groups. That include policy reformation, finance, advisory, technical, and also just transition. The World Bank is actively contributing both in policy reform and also just transition working groups. So I also involved in that working group as the World Bank representative. And at this stage, the working groups proposes to focus on the investment plan of the 5 key areas, but this is subjected to be approved by the government. So first is development of the transmission line. Second is the early retirement of the CFPP. 3 is baseload renewable energy acceleration. And 4th is variable renewable energy acceleration. And last is development of the renewable energy supply chain. So talking about the representation of women in mining and energy sector in Indonesia is remain low. So until now we are still like less than 10%, while there are only 5% of decision makers, female decision makers in Indonesia. And this is also parallel with the Indonesia Gender Development Index, which is ranked 101 out of 156 countries in 2021. So since 2000, the gender mainstreaming policy has been progressively established both in national and also local level. For example, like the establishment of the National Action Plan on Gender Mainstreaming that serves a strategic roadmap to promote gender equality and mainstreaming gender perspective across all the ministries and sectors. So, however, some barriers or gap that hinder the effective implementation of these gender mainstreaming policies are still can be found. So one of the barriers are lack of gender disaggregated data and limited gender awareness or common understanding about gender mainstreaming among the policymakers in the sectors. Next is insufficient gender-sensitive policies and program. And the next one is inadequate participation of women in decision-making process. So at this stage, we are preparing the draft report of identifying entry points for women climate leadership in coal transition in Indonesia. So based on the preliminary findings of our paper, so we observe several points. So first is lack of gender mainstreaming perspective in the recent renewable energy policies. So there are still lots of gaps to improve and fill in the gaps, both in national and also local policies. So the paper is also look at the whole coal supply chain in Indonesia, including formal industries represented by the private sectors and non-formal industries represented by the artisanal coal miners community. So the energy transition brings some pressures on the coal energy market in Indonesia and pushes the coal companies have to diversify and change their business strategies at the moment. So pressures may derive from the financiers and majority shareholders, and women representation in the coal supply chain, both in upstream and also downstream business, are also remain low, less than 20%, based on our research. So the lowest representative are from the coal contractors service. And from the ISM sectors, women's role are limited to coal scavenging at the coal stockpile yard. Last is the energy transition and decarbonization will bring significant changes on mining technologies and will affect the types of occupation and employment opportunities in large-scale mining in the future. So from Indonesia context, numerous large Indonesian mining companies are moving forward towards Industry 4.0, but many of them still face some difficulties in capturing the business impact. And digital transformation requires new skills. And this paper highlights some new skills as the entry points for women to take lead to excel the digitalization in mining. So that's all from me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maya. So I would like now to move to the questions of the audience. If you want to ask something, just raise your hand. Okay. And we'll give you the microphone, so we have someone over here. Please just identify yourself and ask the question. Who would like to take that? Mike?
Yeah, I think it's absolutely key. Yep. And this is so important, we're hearing it twice. Yeah, I think that's absolutely key. So how do we take these big ideas and in a way translate them and make sure that they land up in the investment plans? Given that every country is different, their context is different, given that there are enormous vested interests in all of these places, these ideas are contested. They're very complex, so there's no easy answer, and they're changing over time. So all of that means that we can't predetermine the answers. We can't say this is what needs to be in the investment plan. What we have been able to do, though, is to design a set of questions that help people to think through as they work on these, people from all different sectors of society, whether it be government or labor, civil society or business, to think through what would this mean in our situation. So for example, if we're looking at relevance, we're asking questions like, what is needed in this particular place? And that might be defined, for example, in a nationally determined contribution or a national development plan. What is planned? So what is going into the ACT investment plan or the JETP investment plan? And are they aligned? And that simple question, I think, helps people to think through what it would mean in their context. We do similar questions around systemic change, what systems need to change and how, and who needs to be involved and how. So we ask the procedural justice question around who needs to be involved in defining where the system boundaries are. Because if we draw a system boundary around a technological aspect, then all the engineers are involved and they determine what it is that needs to happen in that system. If we draw the boundary around a social system of access and ownership, suddenly a whole different set of role players are involved. So how we define system boundaries is important. So those questions, I think, are helping us to probe it, and we have kind of layers of complexity to those questions. So they start off very simple, and then we support what kind of outcomes do we have in mind and what processes are needed in order to achieve those, and a set of questions that kind of progressively help people to think through. And so we ran ACT clinics before people started to develop the investment plans. Those ACT clinics highlighted these questions around just transitions, around transformational change, around gender and social inclusion. And in that way, right up front, started to shape the process. I should also say that the actual program documents have as key investment criteria a focus on these considerations as well. So all the way through, it's designed in the monitoring, evaluation, and learning processes that we're developing. Also have, how do we design in these things? How do we do formative, evaluative work as it's being implemented? How do we ensure that these considerations are taken into summative and systematic reviews at the end of programs? So right through the program and project life cycle. So there are many touch points, I think, but those are some of the ways that we're grappling with it. Yeah.
Thanks for the question. We have a next question here.
Good morning. My name is Khulud. I'm working at ADSEC.
Could you speak a little bit louder?
Of course.
Thanks. Easy, Thando. Easy stuff.
Yes, thank you. All right, so key messages. I think the first thing is always the question of participation. And the difficult thing about participation is how do we move it beyond tokenistic type of participation and real participation, right? And so the message is, for decision makers, always, always, always engage with particularly young people, and there's no level of engagement that is enough. Because the issue is, you can start to engage with different youth in different spaces, but because young people we can consider ourselves, I guess, the leaders, much of what it is that we're talking about, and because of the time horizons that we're looking at, this work needs to, I mean, we're looking at 2050, for example, for net zero. So the young people are going to be the ones who are largely going to be implementing different parts of this as time moves on. So the level of engagement that we do early on allows for early adoption, early understanding of some of these very difficult concepts, so that by the time that people move into these spaces, one has already has a fair level of understanding of where the conversation has come from and where the conversation is going. They've got the relevant context around what has worked in the past and what doesn't work, and now what we're looking at is specifically things that we know that as time has gone on, these ones are the key interventions that we need to look at that allow for greater participation, greater involvement. And so I would say, participation beyond tokenism. Around the capacity building issue, the difficult thing about capacity building is there's a lot of it to be done. How we approach it is we try to break it up, and I think many others do the same thing. So respective to the theme. So if we look, for example, at what the PCC is doing, the Presidential Climate Commission and the Presidential PCFTT.
Presidential Climate Finance Task Team.
That one, which is the guys that are looking at the implementation of the JET-P, the working groups. There's dedicated themes around climate finance, adaptation, mitigation, and power generation, and all these things, which obviously allows for a wider range of youth to be able to participate in different aspects of this transformation and the just transition. And so the capacity building has to be very much respective to those things, and you walk with people, you walk with young people through all of these steps, because if I'm put it candidly, let's call them the non-youth participants sit with the knowledge. But the youth participants sit with a different kind of knowledge which could benefit as well from the non-youth participation. And the capacity building aspect allows for those two to be married, and the more we do it, the more seamless, I guess, it becomes. Thanks.
Thank you so much for the question. Do we have a next one? Okay. Just please identify yourself.
I'm sorry, but
Thank you so much for the question. Who will like to answer that? Thanks, Mike.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. I think one of the challenges in this work is where do we find the normative basis for a just transition? So justice can be defined in many different ways. What do we reach for as the kind of, I suppose, foundation or base of that very kind of subjective notion of what justice would entail? And I think that the human rights work is one of the most solid foundations for that. And so you'll see in a lot of this work a kind of reaching for things like procedural justice, the inclusion, as you mentioned, the inclusion of marginalized or vulnerable communities. Issues around things like access to a safe and healthy environment. So things like climate neutrality will be built into the definition. Issues of equity. So how do we build in equity into these processes? So I think that when you ask how do we build in human rights, first of all, I want to say that it is probably the best foundation that we have as a collective kind of expression of what we would like to do in terms of justice and rights systems. And then secondly, that we actually have to very consciously build it into the way that we define just transitions, or the way that we define transformational change, or the way that we define gender equity. And so, all that I can say, Sarah, is that important reference point, and we need to make sure that it is in our definitions, in our principles, and in the kinds of frameworks that we develop. And I think that it is in this work that SIF is doing and that is feeding into ACT. But I think a big role of the observers, as you know, is to, in a way, keep us all honest and clear on those processes. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. Next question here. We have here the next question.
Thank you.
Especially when I reflect about it, and a lot of the challenges has to do with gender norms and gender biases, and how men are always related to work in the mines, and women tend to be like a more domestic task, and that's why we express and we see all of this gender-based violence. How do you see moving forward the agenda and the interconnection between youth, indigenous communities, and women for this transformational change, always respecting cultural inheritance? Thank you.
It's a complex question. I'm just making sure that colleagues will come into it. But I think from the social inclusion perspective, we really are trying to have this intersectionality lens and look much broader. I think using the concept of procedural justice and then identifying which are the different groups, how are they marginalized, for which reasons they are excluded, and how to bring them into the conversation. In conversation on gender, I think there is a lot of also understanding that the push towards gender equality and the gains in the recent years have also globally, and not only in developing countries, but very much in developed countries as well, have generated a pushback. And there is some rolling back in the gains of previous decades. So how to address that, how to work with male allies and really, but also like looking at the different complex identities, young women, a young person with a disability, an indigenous person, an indigenous woman or indigenous person with disability. Those are all identities that could make situation much more complicated. So I think it's looking at inclusive processes for different groups, but then also doing really targeted work. For example, on the issue of persons with disabilities, this is something that CIF has started to do some analytical and advocacy work this year. We plan to move into more practical application space where we're preparing a guidance note related specifically to the Act on what are the specific issues and what could be done within the projects, and then looking for projects or interventions where we can go a little bit deeper with this. On indigenous people, there has been a lot of work, especially by our stakeholders team so far, but I think also one of our priorities for next year to have it a little bit more systematically and targeted. So lots of work to be done. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nina. Thanks for the question. Do we have another question? Okay. I'll start to sing a Brazilian song if you don't ask questions. So, I would like to ask one question of myself to anyone who wants to answer it. In your opinion, what are the key factors for the ACT program to work in this transformation from coal energy to clean energy? Can you name a few key factors?
Let me start.
Thanks, Sandra.
I will start and let's see how it goes. So I think one of the main things is the support in terms of the concessional finance that has to be there. I think Mafalda touched on that this morning as well. So that commitment and the political will is crucial, that materializes, that's not just, in the air, but that also translates into reality in terms of the support that's needed. I think then for the ACT program, the sort of key pillar is really the people's pillar, which I think a lot of panel members have already discussed here today, because if you don't have that on board, it will not succeed. It will be very, very difficult to make this transition happen. And so without that, it's very tricky. From a results perspective, from my perspective where I sit, another crucial element is that we all work towards the same goal, and we're all following that sort of vision and blueprint for this ACT program, so that we're all kind of in one direction and not going in different directions all over the place. So those things are key in my opinion. I'm happy to hand over to someone else in the panel.
Yeah, maybe just to build on the last point that Sandra made, this notion of working in the same direction, setting a kind of aspirational goal and that is shared, and then working on it, I think is absolutely vital. One of the big pieces of work I think is going to need to be done around that is to take the monitoring and evaluation and learning frameworks that sit within the different institutions and national governments, and seek to align them. So, the CIF may have its kind of overarching impact goal, The multilateral development banks will have theirs that they're working towards. The governments of the various countries will have theirs in their national development plans or in their various frameworks. And I think that there needs to be a fair bit of work at aligning those and making sure that they happen. And certainly in South Africa, for example, the Presidential Climate Commission and others have been reaching out and saying we're developing monitoring and evaluation frameworks. We're doing it, as Thando said, with the Department of Planning, Monitoring and Evaluation, and let's work together on trying to develop some of these frameworks. So that, I think, is absolutely key. The other one that I think will be key, and I might be slightly biased here from where I sit, but I think is deepening the transformational intent of this work. It's no good if we essentially create a business as usual and just shift the sources of energy. We actually need to shift some quite basic socioeconomic structures that help us to reach greater inclusivity, greater equity, greater ecological sustainability. And I'm not sure that we can do that within some of the systems that we have at the moment. And so to find ways of doing that, and again, I think that there's some really innovative work going on around ACT and some of the key partners to say how do we shift things like ownership structures as we move towards or as we move out of coal? How do we increase things like access and who has access to energy as we make these transitions? So I think that those are really key considerations as well.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks, Sandra. Thando, would you like to say a few words?
Yes, Vico. So my intervention might actually dovetail quite a bit on Mike's. So the first thing I would like to say, though, is to say it's very important that we move beyond just the risk mitigation aspect. As important as it is, I think the social dynamics, particularly in a country like South Africa, for example, and I'm very biased, of course, are very, very key. And I think the transformational agenda is part of the way in which we try to manifest that change. And so this is where my part kind of dovetails off of Mike's intervention, is to say, particularly as young people, and in the country that I'm from, we've seen how the vested interests continue to have a stronghold on different parts of the economy, particularly the energy sector. And so if, as young people, we are wanting to participate more so in this change, it's necessary that it's not only that we're involved in these processes, but the system itself has to adjust itself to give us that space to be able to participate. And so those two things for me are absolutely key. And of course, it's not to say that we're perfect. Certainly the PCC is one of such institutions which is trying to bring in and manifest this kind of transformational agenda outside of the NDP. But it's not yet there. And I think a big part of it is the social dialogue part, which is how do we engage constantly with our different partners. Through those engagements, then we're finding space how particular interventions might have their manifestations. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's hard to build on those amazing comments, but just to deepen one of the comment that Sandra made about the need for concessional finance, and to argue that more dedicated grants, grant resources that could go directly to the communities, that could be managed by those communities, and the communities can be empowered in the process, I think is a very, very important way of addressing it. And the other thing, when we talk about the resources, the ACT resources are already not very small, but then if we look at it at the broader picture of JETP, but then there is an issue that is not often brought up in those conversations, but the concerns around corruption, concerns about efficient use of the resources. And I believe that the concept of social accountability, giving much stronger role to the communities, to the CSOs, to the observers. We at CIF have mechanisms where we have CSOs, observers looking at our work, but creating those mechanisms quite systematically and from the very local level up is very essential, and really giving that space for those advocates from the communities to be able to watch how those investment plans are implemented, providing feedback. So social accountability mechanisms are crucial for those resources to be really used in such a way that it brings the transformational change.
Thanks, Nina. We will soon make the transition from coal to coffee. But before that, just let me tell you that if you have any other questions about this, you can reach Abhishek Bhaskar. Abhi, he's there, okay. You can talk to him. He's the lead from the CIF, so you can talk to him. I think this kind of meeting is also important to make this kind of informal contacts during coffee, for instance. And we will have a 30 minutes coffee break soon. And next door, you will be able as well to visit our CIF Connect space, where CIF's evaluation and learning and monitoring and results experts are on standby to present their latest research. So please join them for a cup of coffee and much more. We will. Where is the coffee, people? It's upstairs. So good to know. The coffee is upstairs, and we will meet at 12 o'clock noon. Okay. To have a very important discussion on women on climate leadership, okay? So let's give a hand to our panelists. Thank you so much, everybody. Me too, or no?